the local police attacked the protesters. Jackson, his mother, and his grandfather ran into a nearby cafe. The police pursued them and started beating the 82-year-old man. His mother tried to pull the police off her father, and they began beating her. And when Jackson tried to pull the police off his mother, they shot him. Jackson's murder was what led the civil rights movement to plan the Selma to Montgomery March. Originally, they had said we should carry his coffin to the steps of the state capitol. Then the morning after Bloody Sunday, so 50 years ago today, Dr. King sent out a call to clergy all around the country to join the march. About a dozen Unitarian Universalist clergy answered his call, including the Reverends James Reeb, Orloff Miller, and Clark Olson. That evening, 50 years ago today, these three white Unitarian Universalist clergy went out to get dinner together in Selma and were attacked by a group of white men who called them racial slurs. One of the men hit Reeb in the head with a pipe. He died of his head wounds 2 days later. Thousands of people sent letters to President Johnson decrying the violence and calling for federal intervention on behalf of the movement. Johnson had not received a single letter when Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered. After Reeb's murder, hundreds more Unitarian Universalists and thousands more people came down to Selma. And on March 15th, the night of Reverend Reeb's funeral, President Johnson called on Congress to pass the voting rights legislation. The Historic Voting Rights Act was introduced and signed into the law over the summer. The following Sunday, after Reeb's funeral and the introduction of the act, the civil rights movement completed their march from Montgomery to Selma, this time under federal protection and with 30,000 marchers rather than 500. At the end of the march, a member of the KKK shot and killed the white Unitarian Universalist lay leader, Viola Luiso, as she was shuttling marchers back and forth from the end of the march. This weekend, many people who were involved in the civil rights movement, including many Unitarian Universalists, are down in Selma, commemorating the 50th anniversary of these events. The civil rights movement put their bodies on the line in order to change the system of Jim Crow, and this weekend marks the anniversary of some of the biggest and most costly wins of the movement. This is not a coincidence. Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Council's strategy was to use nonviolent civil disobedience to provoke public and dramatic violence from the authorities in order to expose the brutality and the injustice of Jim Crow on a national stage. By generating public outcry, they intended to put enough pressure on the federal authorities to have the federal authorities intervene in the South, where black people had no electoral power and were thus excluded from the ability to make changes in their governance. So the drama was intentional. It was part of the strategies and tactics of the movement. It's not to say that Dr. King or the SCLC had any intention that anyone would be killed, but they did understand the risk. They planned it, and they faced that risk themselves. Indeed, many of the leaders of the movement paid for the change they created with their lives. So folks in Selma this weekend are honoring those sacrifices. They're honoring the people who made them, and they're celebrating the victories that were won at the ultimate price. They're also reflecting on what's happening today. They're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't know if you've heard, but another unarmed black teenager was killed this weekend, this time in Madison, Wisconsin. On Friday night, a 19-year-old Tony Robinson was shot and killed by a Madison Police Department officer in his home. Police had been called for a disturbance, and because Robinson had been, quote, running in and out of traffic. The police department has said there was no evidence that Robinson had a gun. The officer shot him multiple times and then administered CPR. Robinson died later that evening at the hospital. Those in Selma today are also talking about voting rights. So, in 1965, 50 years ago, the Voting Rights Act passed due to the incredible sacrifices of the members of the movement, and in the summer of 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the most important provision of the Voting Rights Act after the movement paid for it with their lives, their blood, their sweat, and their tears. Without the federal requirement for equal voting rights, a number of states have moved very quickly to impose regulations that would disproportionately affect minority voters' ability to vote today. Have you ever tried to make a fire using green wood? You're camping and ill-prepared, not that any of you would ever be ill-prepared. And for some reason, all of those nice dry sticks are just missing from the area around your campsite. You find a few sticks, but half of them are green and you can't even break them because they're too bendy. And then they take forever to burn and your fire piddles out in a sad, lackluster pile of poorly planned mush. The fresh green sticks are too flexible to break. The dried up and dead ones are rigid and they break quickly and easily, even the big ones. Our culture valorizes rigidity as strength. There are all these action movies where the super tough masculine hero never bends, never negotiates, never compromises, never listens, sometimes never even responds. This is the mainstream picture of strength. But in reality, flexibility is much more difficult to break than rigidity. Think about dropping a ceramic teacup versus dropping a pillow, for instance. Flexibility is a quality of resilience. Resilience in simple systems, systems that don't have the ability to learn, is the capacity to return to its original form after some sort of disturbance. Like, for instance, trying to break a green twig over your knee. Resilience in complex systems, systems that do have the capacity to learn, is the ability to withstand, or even better, creatively adapt to disturbance while still retaining form, function, and identity. We human beings are complex systems. We have the ability to learn. We can only make use of that ability, however, if we understand what's going on. Awareness is perhaps the first quality of resilience. It's a precondition for learning and adaptation. Awareness requires listening, attention, and the ability to recognize both patterns and impacts. States that are introducing voter ID laws, for instance, say that they are doing so to curb so-called voter fraud, even though studies have shown that voter fraud is almost non-existent. The impacts of the laws, however, rather than curtailing this non-existent phenomenon, disproportionately reduce the ability of minorities to vote. We might remember that in the Jim Crow South, citizenship tests were supposedly about making sure there was an informed electorate. But in reality, the impact was that the test prevented Black people from voting. In her book, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander argues that the forces that benefit from white supremacy, she calls it a racial caste system, have reinvented the system after justice movements have risen up and challenged it. Resilience and its attributes, awareness, learning, and adaptation, is a morally neutral concept. The system of white supremacy has proven itself to be quite resilient. When slavery ended with the Emancipation Proclamation and Reconstruction, Black people seized the opportunity for leadership all over the South. They created and owned their own businesses, stepped into power, ran for office, and won. But the racial caste system learned and adapted. White supremacists created Jim Crow and systematically destroyed those businesses and removed Black representation from our democratic system of governance. Then the Civil Rights Movement rose up, challenged that system, and overturned it. Alexander contends that the racial caste system learned again, reorganized itself, adapted, and created the contemporary racial caste system, which is mass incarceration. According to Alexander and the work and research of other sociologists and criminologists, mass incarceration, and particularly the war on drugs, disproportionately impacts communities of color despite almost exactly the same rates of offending. Even though study after study has shown that all races use and sell illegal drugs at the same rate, and when there is a difference, it's that white people use and sell them more. Black people only make up 13% of the US population, but they make up 30% of drug arrests. No other country in the world incarcerates as many of its racial or ethnic minorities as the United States does, including apartheid, South Africa, at the height of apartheid. And in the United States, once a person is convicted of a crime, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against them in housing and employment. Felons lose their right to vote. Alexander estimates that nearly a third of Black men will be incarcerated at some point in their lives, which means facing permanent legal discrimination when they get out of prison. The brilliance of this system of reorganization of racial hierarchy is that it both legally and justifiably criminalizes people of color, presumably not because they are not white, but because they are criminals. It's much more difficult to defend someone or fight for their rights if society has already agreed that they have violated the law. They are no longer the perfect victim, no longer deserving of citizenship. The system makes the case that the people who are caught up in it deserve to be so. However, as we know, white people and people of color are not punished for crimes in the same way or at the same rate. Their mistakes are not seen in the same light. Police violence in the criminal justice system capitalizes on the narrative that criminals deserve what they get. The first thing Tony Robinson's mother said publicly this weekend after she found out that her son had been killed was that she requested the authorities not dehumanize him. This is not a request that white mothers have to make. And I am aggrieved to tell you that one of my first questions when I read about Robinson's death, Robinson's killing, was, what did he do? I started reading all the articles for the reason the police were called, for what happened, for why the officer chose to shoot him. I am white, and I was raised in the midst of this narrative, in the midst of this new Jim Crow. My first question was about what the person who got shot did to deserve getting shot. Would I have asked the same question about an unarmed white teenager? This is why the arguments in Ferguson were about Michael Brown's character, and why the meme that we're saying again and again and again is Black Lives Matter. We need to be able to move away from the need for a perfect victim and towards an understanding that Black lives are inherently worthy, inherently no matter the circumstances. If the movement for justice is going to be as resilient as the racial caste system, then once we are able to clearly identify and name what is going on right now, we have to then adapt to the new circumstances. The forces working to maintain white supremacy have not only reorganized the system of racial discrimination, but they have also learned our tactics of resistance and have adapted to minimize our ability to challenge the system. I grew up in a movement that learned strategy and tactics from the civil rights movement. They were the best. They won. They were brilliant, strategic organizers. However, as I was learning those tactics, the opposition was also studying them and developing methods to neutralize them. The brilliant and effective tactics of 50 years ago are not necessarily having the same success today. Even as we celebrate the successes of the civil rights movement and honor its leaders and memorialize its sacrifices, so too, we must be open to new ways of organizing, new strategies and tactics, new ways of understanding narrative, new leaders, and new prophets. We must take yesterday's lessons and bring them into the present. In resilience theory, it is our previous successes turned into rigid attachments that bring about our downfall. When something is working, we become so enamored of it that we rigidly attach to it without the sort of feedback loops that tell us whether that previously successful strategy is still working today. We become a dry stick, easy to break. We have to develop flexibility and feedback in our movements in order to succeed in present circumstances. As President Barack Obama said at the Selma commemoration yesterday, if Selma has taught us anything, it is that our work is never done. The American experiment in self-government gives work and purpose to each generation. 50 years from Bloody Sunday, our march is not yet finished, but we are getting closer. If we want to honor the courage of those who marched that day, then all of us are called to possess their moral imagination. Moral imagination. We must meet today's challenges while carrying the lessons from yesterday and still have the flexibility to adapt to today's reality with creativity and courage. As we march on, we must continue to bring love forward with us and keep love at the center of our work. This is why we do what we do. This is why we come back again and again. The Reverend Alan Taylor has begun asking the question, where is love beckoning you now? For me, I'm being called to build the beloved community today with hope, heart, and relationship. Hope that creativity will come and we will meet this new world of struggle with imagination. Our elders have triumphed against all odds in the past, and we can too. We can choose justice over comfort. We can choose morality over the status quo. We can choose awareness over denial. Today we can choose resilience, choose love, and choose dynamic and creative resistance. And we must do this in accountable relationships with love and joy. We must be able to hold ourselves accountable. Notice what the first question we ask ourselves is when we read that new article and offer it to the people as a way of reflection of who we are and how we are part of this whole system. We must reach out across borders of class and race and culture. And we must listen carefully to those who have experiences different than our own, particularly those who are affected by the new voter laws and those who have been affected by mass incarceration. We must build the beloved community through relationships of accountability with people as diverse as this world. Today, against all odds, we can honor our elders by choosing resilience again. May it be so, and blessed be. Will you all please rise in either body or in spirit and join us in the closing hymn number 6, Just as Long as I Have Known. Though we extinguish the light of the chalice here, we carry its light and warmth with us in our hearts. Blessed be and amen.